Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another of the Daily Mavericks live journalism webinars. Today's webinar is a special webinar to talk about eSwatini. It is titled Protest and Repression in eSwatini, Why Should We Care? When we planned this webinar about 6 weeks ago, it was in the wake of an uprising that had caused possibly as many as 80 deaths. We didn't know when we planned it that it would fall in the middle of another revolt against the lack of democracy and the absolute monarchy in that country. And so we're holding the webinar at a very difficult time. Just yesterday, as I think we'll hear, there were protests that led to more deaths in that country. And I know that many of the people who are joining us on today's webinar are joining us from within eSwatini. So I think it's appropriate that before we get going, I just start by expressing all of our sorrow and solidarity with the people of eSwatini, with the crisis that is going on in that country at the moment. So we send you our condolences and our best wishes. But it also makes today's discussion a very topical and a very necessary and a very immediate one. The purpose today is to launch a report called Dark Days in eSwatini that has been produced by the Campaign for Free Expression, a new organization that has been set up to advance the cause of freedom of expression throughout Southern Africa. And this is their first and I think very important report. And we're very, very fortunate that to discuss that report and to discuss what is happening in eSwatini, we writers of the report, both of them are very experienced journalists. So let me just introduce them quickly. First of all, Bheki Makhubu. Bheki is coming from Mbabane in eSwatini. We were worried yesterday about internet blackouts and cutoffs, but you can see that he is here with us from that country. Bheki, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bheki is the editor of The Nation magazine, a monthly publication based in eSwatini. And then center of my screen is Carien du Plessis. Good morning, Carien. Good afternoon, Carien. Joining us from Johannesburg, a well-established, much-respected journalist and writer, writing for the Daily Maverick and other publications, and also one of the authors of this publication. We have online over 200 people. And I would encourage all of you to feel free to ask any questions that you may have in the chat, any commentary that you wish to place in the chat. If you are in eSwatini and you want to tell us what is happening, please feel free to use the chat for that purpose. And as you can also see, we are putting links to the report. Dark Days in eSwatini has been posted by Anton Harbour in the chat. So let's get going. Bheki, I'd like you to start just by telling us a little bit about this report, but also as somebody who is based in eSwatini, give us a little bit of the background to the protest and repression that is taking place in your country. Thank you, Bheki.
Yeah, well, a lot of things started to build up I'd say towards the end of May, mid-May to end of May, when a young university student died in circumstances that were not clear. You know, he died and his body disappeared, and then the police were sort of called out to explain what happened to him. In fact, there's an ongoing inquest, but that call was mainly driven by university students. He was a fifth-year LLB student at the University of Swaziland, so his colleagues were how death and the circumstances surrounding that. And it sort of created a build-up because, you know, with these things anyway in the world, a small incident triggers a lot of other bigger issues. And parallel to that, you had a lot of activity going on in Parliament where some MPs, two of whom are in jail now, were starting to agitate for change. Change that had constitutional implications, saying we shouldn't have a prime minister that is appointed by the king. He should rather stand for, some people should stand for national elections. Now understand that since independence in Swaziland, the prime minister has been drawn from the Dlamini people. It has never been anyone else except Dlamini. And, you know, over the years, there has been that thing that why should they be the only ones who become prime minister? And I think my understanding is what the MPs were doing was to try and focus on that issue. But the MPs had trouble getting the necessary support in Parliament, and they began to talk about it outside Parliament too. But outside Parliament was also not just this university students' issue, but the youth of the country who had their own issues with joblessness growing so exponentially in the country, because the country is doing very badly in terms of, you know, economic growth. Things just piled up one after the other. They were started delivering petitions at the constituencies where they elect their MPs. And I think where everything sort of got out of hand was when government banned the delivery of petitions. Government claimed that it wasn't good in a COVID environment because there were huge gatherings of people. But nobody bought into that. You know, historically, we know ourselves that we're a country where people are not exactly encouraged to speak their minds and speak out. So it was seen as a clampdown on free speech and all that. And it just spiraled out of control then. And we had the June unrest, you know, that took about a week. And there was looting and burning, and it was a surprise to all of us, you know. Historically, no one can trace this kind of behavior anywhere. It's a first. It was a first. And it happened. And after it had happened, then the MPs were arrested and charged with all sorts of crimes. You know, now they've actually even, in the last week, they filed new charges against them, one of which is murder, for deaths that occurred in June, from what I understand. So what you have now, you saw things sort of fizzled out, and it did look like we were over what had happened in June, at least in terms of the violence that occurred. But you know,
Bheki, we
that this problem would come back. It was anybody thinking logically would have seen that. It's just that it has come back now and quite soon, but it was always going to come back. Yeah.
Thank you, Bheki. And as I understand it, the two MPs are still in prison and have been since they were arrested. Carien, would you like to add anything on the background and what you've seen as a journalist that explains what is happening at the moment?
Yeah, Mark, I must say I've covered eSwatini, Swaziland from the outside more than from the inside. Well, in the last year or so, basically due to COVID and restrictions on movement. But I remember at the time when the riots happened in June, we were wondering, is it going to go on? Is it going to be short-lived? I remember Bheki said to me at some point, they've stopped looting because there's nothing left to loot. But the anger remained, and I think the protests are continuing in a different form as we see now. And then, of course, shortly after the troubles in eSwatini, South Africa had its own problems. I remember writing this report. It was shortly after our looting and arson happened in KwaZulu-Natal. I was trying to write this report as well as, make sense of what's happening here. So it was a really difficult time, I think, for both countries at the time, which probably explains why it kind of went off South Africa's radar for a bit. And I think perhaps the latest protest there didn't catch us by surprise, but I think I think we should have kept tabs on it a lot more. But like I said, we've got our own troubles, we've got elections, which I've been very busy with. And interestingly enough, looking at our elections and eSwatini's elections, I went there to cover elections. Having a political party in eSwatini is illegal. So I think people sitting in South Africa worrying about our local government elections, in a way, it's just to think how bad things are that side, is that you can't even form a political party legally and sort of go and campaign for your political party. And I think that's one of the big problems that the protesters want addressed. So I think that's from my side, just to sort of add those thoughts.
So we've established political parties are illegal, that several MPs are in prison. Bheki, I believe that the figures about the numbers of people who lost their lives is something in the region of up to 80 people at the end of June into July, and that there were further deaths yesterday. Crisply, what are the protests about? What are people's demands? What would diffuse this crisis that we're seeing in eSwatini at the moment? Please, I might need you to switch off your video. Let's see how it comes across when you answer my question now. But there was a little bit of disruption earlier on. But yes, Bheki, can you try and pull out what are the critical issues that exist in the country and which you found in your report?
Well, there's, to be honest with you, I think, look, you can't honestly place the problems in Swaziland to, say, the beginning of the year in May. Right. It's been a build-up over many, many years. That's how I see it. There's been a growing disconnect between the people and the king. The king representing not just as a head of state, but as representing our identity as a people. The way I view him, he has gone on a tangent to live a life that does not identify with the people he leads. And in that process, there has been a gap in leadership. As a people, if times are hard and life is difficult, as it is in Swaziland, with jobs losses and an economy, it is to the king that we look for answers and we find comfort. But one gets the sense that he has not availed himself of that responsibility in time, and that has caused frustrations. And in the process, he has lived a life. He has continued to live a life of quite obscene wealth. He's improved his lifestyle. He's got Rolls Royces and stuff like that. So there's been that growing discontent among people. And I mean, Swazi people, I always say that we are probably one of the most dangerous people in the region because we don't say much, when there's a problem. Until it reaches a crisis, then you see them for what they are. I'm one of the few people who will stomp and make noise and write stuff and say this is not okay. Swazi it's not a typical Swazi thing. But what is typical of Swazis is when there's a crisis, you might find that you are alone when you thought they were your friends, because that's when you see that they didn't like what you've been doing. And so it's a build-up. I mean, as I say in the article, the royal family has really disconnected from the people. And let me tell you, in doing so, I mean, if you listen to the arguments, and I got to tell you, for me as a Swazi, they are strange, but they're also a reflection of where we are. When you speak of things traditional these days, that is part of who we are. There's a sort of dismissiveness towards it, as if it's something that was imposed on us. But that's only because the king himself represents all things Swazi. So in trying to reject the way we are living, we are beginning to reject who we are. And that's what worries me, because I disagree. He doesn't represent the fact that I'm a Swazi. He might be the custodian of all things Swazi, but my identity doesn't come from him. But because in recent times, what I've been seeing, particularly on social media, has been a shift from a seeking reform. People are now doing away with the monarchy, which I think is an even more complicated issue than seeking reform. But it has moved with such speed in the last 3 or 4 months from we want reform to they must all go. And to me, that's an even more onerous task than where we were when the riots occurred in June. So, things are just spiraling out of control in Swaziland as far as I'm concerned.
Thanks, Bheki. I'm going to stay.
It's a bit worrying.
I'm going to stay with you for a second before I move to Carien and talk about the media in eSwatini, Swaziland. There are a number of questions and comments which you've partially answered. What's the envisaged role of the monarchy in a new democratic eSwatini? Is it true that the king has fled the country? Please tell us about the children that the royal family keeps as slaves. The world needs to know. And somebody disagrees with you and says, Bheki, get to the point. Swazis are demanding the democratization of the country. Your narrative about disconnecting with the king is nonsense. Will the king survive this uprising? Will the monarchy survive this? Should the monarchy survive this uprising when it has gone so counter to the wishes of the people and has been behind the massacre of Swazis?
Well, I can't say whether he's going to survive it. I can say that he was out in public last week, I think, and he spoke at an opening of a referral hospital. My impression of him was he's extremely worried about what's going on. He has dug in. He's not backing down. But I'd argue that he's also not sleeping well. He's worried. Whether he's going to survive will depend on what event. Look, what happened yesterday, for instance, I wouldn't have told you on Monday is going to happen. Strange things are happening in Swaziland. On the question of whether I'm talking nonsense or not, like I say, you've got to understand historically who we are, not what happened in the last 4 months and where we come from. You've got to look at where we come from and what we've always. But this is the point. They will say I'm talking nonsense because things have moved so fast that nobody wants to identify with anything that doesn't fit the narrative that is being discussed. My problem with that, though, is then how do you understand who you are dealing with? You know, for instance, there's the question of, has the king fled? When it was said he fled in June, my instinctive reaction was, if I know the king, and he's not my friend, but I've written a lot about him, he's not going to go anywhere. You know, he wouldn't want. The last thing he'd want to be seen as is a coward. You know, given the way he is, he sees himself, you know, as a king. Sometimes one gets the impression he does see himself as a warrior king. So for him, if my opinion were to be asked, I'd say, for him, a fight is something he relishes. He sees himself as belonging to that old school African warrior king living in modern times. So, you know, he's not going to run away soon.
Which is a scary thing, because it suggests...
But my point is, in order to deal with him, you've got to understand that and then work on that in order to make him come round. But people are not interested in that. They see it as, this guy says, nonsense. So you're going to have this standoff going on back and forth for quite a while. And a lot of people are going to be hurt. A lot of people are, you know, lives are going to be lost. You know, because you are not watching the person you are dealing with.
Yeah, I want to move on back to Carien. It just seems to me that this again is an example. We have an impasse, and we're going to talk a little bit later about the role of South Africa, about SADC, etc., what needs to be done at the moment. But I think nobody can dispute that the king has a lot of blood on his hands, and I know that a complaint has been made to the International Criminal Court and so on. You know, I can't see how a king who has ordered soldiers to massacre people on the scale that we've seen in eSwatini can continue to hold the position that he does at this moment in time. But that's, as you say, that's at the heart of the matter. Carien, I want to move to you now. Just before I come to you, I'm watching the chat. I'm seeing people saying that some people are struggling with the strength of signal from in eSwatini. Some people feeling that the internet is being blocked, that this webinar might be being blocked. We do know that there have been internet shutdowns in the past, and I believe yesterday for a few hours. I can assure people that the webinar is being recorded and it will be made available as soon as possible tomorrow. The recording, we'll get that recording out to you. But Carien, can you talk a little bit about the role of the media in this situation? You're a journalist. You've been part of this report by the campaign for free expression. Can you talk about both the role of the media in eSwatini, but also about the role of the media outside eSwatini in trying to help the world understand the nature of the crisis in this little country in Southern Africa?
Yeah, Mark, I must say, I really appreciate Bheki's insights into how people perceive the king and how the king perceives himself. I think it's very important, and I think he does very important work in explaining that aspect, as well as, I mean, it's quite obvious why people are protesting in terms of poverty. I mean, that's easy to understand, but the king is not so easy to understand. And I think part of the role of the media should be to explain these, you know, these nuances, because you need those nuances in terms of, I mean, I don't want to, we'll speak about SADC just now, but in terms of negotiations, in terms of, you know, you have to persuade people to come to the table to talk, and you need to understand the whole scenario. So I think in that sense, the media is very important. And my part of the report looked at freedom of expression from, you know, from outside. Like, I was looking at journalists who wanted to go into eSwatini and cover the protests there. I think with this developing story, it will be important as well to see which media houses will try and attempt to go into Eswatini to help with the coverage, to bring the story out, you know, to get it out to the world. Because I also think it's important that the world sees it. It's no use just, you know, just having coverage inside Eswatini. I think that, you know, the country needs help from outside from outside the country, and also from South Africa and the region to help. So in that sense, the media is important, and I think the media in Eswatini plays a different role to the media outside, perhaps, because although we've seen some South African journalists from the New Frame during the June protests, we saw some South Africans being severely manhandled and tortured by police, which was, I think, it was a first. It was the worst that we have seen. And I think locally, Swazi journalists get subjected to that kind of, you know, well, not torture all the time, but people, you know, you have to be careful. You have to be careful for your own safety. So in that sense, I think journalists from the outside, we can go in, we can cover the story, we can come out, and you know, sort of live in relative peace and safety back in South Africa. So I think in that sense it helps to amplify the story, to augment the story. It helps. You know, I saw some remarks by an ambassador. I think it was the American ambassador that I included in my report. You know, that they see what's happening and they amplify it on the world stage, and they see that through the media. So in that sense, I think it's important, and in that sense, I think South African media houses should also realize. I mean, seeing that we are a neighbor of Swaziland, we can help with what's happening there, and I think in South Africa specifically, we should realize our power and the ability we have to go and cover the story and to help the journalists there. Another journalist said to me that she finds if people are in the country to cover it, you know, if you're from an international media house, it kind of keeps the situation in check as well. Politicians are more careful to behave when they see people who can, you know, who can sort of bring the story out to the rest of the world. They're ashamed to behave in a bad way if there are journalists who can bring the story out. So in that sense, I think the media has real power, and we should realize that. I mean, we're forever writing about SADC not taking action, but I do think we as the media can go in there and help, you know, help the local journalists cover. I think it's very brave to live there and to work in situations like Bheki and the rest of his colleagues, sort of looking at what some journalists who work for media that's sympathetic towards, or that's sort of government-owned or sympathetic towards the government. I mean, they're subjected to self-censorship, they're subjected to threats. And even though they see their own brothers and sisters and friends being, you know, suffering in protests, they have to keep themselves in check. And I think that must be really difficult to kind of go to work every day and to have to check yourself and you know, and see what's happening. And we've had on that one WhatsApp group, there is journalists who send some footage through, and I think WhatsApp and social media, it can play a role. You know, we can play a role to amplify that footage, because he can't publish it back there, but we can publish it here, and it can be seen all over. So in that sense, I think the media has a role in explaining what's happening, and also perhaps by reporting. It's kind of an activist role that we play as well. So I do think we should realize. I mean, I think our editors are very good at realizing the role we play in the South Africa's democracy, and we've done really good work there. But when I listen to some journalists, you know, there's never the resources to go and cover a story in a neighboring country, and I think that should change. And I think perhaps, you know, now is the time to change that.
Thanks, Carien. Bheki, yes, please.
Like to add something there.
Yeah.
You know, I think when it comes to the media, and I've seen many politicians come and go over 30 years plus now. The difference with the people running the government we have now, cabinet ministers, I'd say, is that they have a very, very different outlook on media. That, to me, as I sit here, it still doesn't make sense. They view, if you remember, from 2018, 2019, they actually engaged a South African communications company, Vuma Communications. Yes. Now, to understand Vuma Communications, you have to understand that this government says the media that matters is the South African and international media. Because when they speak of eSwatini, that's where the investors are. The local media, which includes me, the Times, and everybody else, are seen as an irritation, sort of, that needs to be swatted. For instance, you guys are talking about the internet and everything. What you don't know is that there's no newspaper that came out in Swaziland today. No, there are 2 newspapers that come out daily, did not publish today. That to me, whatever the reason, that to me is a stifling of free speech. We can't work because of yesterday's circumstances. You know, that's a tragedy. But, you know, we have been reduced as a media in Swaziland to basically, I don't think this government, if we stopped publishing and there was no newspaper in Swaziland, no print magazine, no radio, I don't think this government would lose sleep. I think what they would worry about is the media outside the country we can talk to, because these guys, all the rights, people like Makhubu, the right nonsense, you know. So there's that hostility that speaks to us being irrelevant to the greater scheme of things. We talk badly. For instance, let me give you an example. The Minister of Finance in Swaziland, Neil Reichenberg, who I've seen has written articles for publications like Financial Mail in South Africa, talking about the Swazi economy, has been on radio shows and stuff talking about Swazi economy. 2 weeks ago, issued a statement saying, issued a directive to all state-owned enterprises under his portfolio that they shouldn't do business with my magazine. Yep. So he's shutting it down. That's what he's doing. Because why should he care? He's got you guys in South Africa who look after his interests, you know? And he sees me as an irritation because, as he says, he can't have people under his portfolio advertising in a publication that doesn't speak well of the king, you know? And you know, you're sort of like, does this guy think he's more Swazi than me? That only his views matter because he's a politician and in office, you know, and that I'm less a Swazi because I'm, you know. So you've got that problem when it comes to the media. It's become more difficult now because if you don't say what they want and don't write what they want, then you're the enemy of the state, you know. And yeah, so
that's another example of the issues and the lack. You know, we have MPs in prison, we have protesters being massacred, we have prime ministers being appointed from one family, and we clearly don't have a free media and freedom of expression for a variety of reasons. And that's why it's so critical, Carien, that people like you in South Africa, people like the British Guardian, the New York Times, the Financial Times, etc., tell the story accurately of eSwatini, and that also we do so consistently, that we don't dip in and out. You know, eSwatini made the media in end of June 2021, and then it fell off the agenda again. And yet the issues didn't go away. It's perhaps going to be back on the agenda for a few days with the revolt that's taking place now. it'll fall away again. We need a media that investigates the monarchy, investigates the companies that are propping up the monarchy. And we know, and I'll ask you to comment on this, Carien, that they're not invulnerable. I mean, I saw your eyes light up when Vuma Reputation Management Company was mentioned. But, you know, but the good news about Vuma Reputation Management was that the media reporting forced them to break their contract with the Swazi government at the beginning of July. And I guess that's what we should be aiming for. Carien.
Yeah, no, that it actually took a while for them to actually to break that contract after we reported on them. Because I remember, was it around October last year? It was sort of after, just sort of towards the end of South Africa's really hard lockdown, or August, I think. Vuma, they sent us an invite to a webinar or a press conference with the Prime Minister, who was then still alive. What was his name? Dlamini something. Ambrose Dlamini, yes. So we had the Prime Minister, we had the Minister of Finance, we had the Minister of Trade and Industry. And I said I remember sent a message to Bheki. I said, wow, have you been invited to this webinar too, to this press conference? And it turned out it was only for foreign journalists. And you know, we sort of had access to that. But then I sort of started looking at this Vuma, you know, what is Vuma's role in all this? And it was basically the good news story about eSwatini, about how unique it is as a monarchy. You know, it's sort of unique selling points. And you think, well, okay, maybe, you know, let's give that, you know, let's listen to what they have to say. And but I do think it's unfair the way that the media there gets treated. That they don't get airtime with the you know, that the journalists don't get airtime to interrogate the politicians in the way that we do here in South Africa. But I think back then I wrote a story for the Daily Maverick about this Vuma, and they got paid quite a few million rand to do the job as well. So that it's, you know, it's not like they did it for free either. And then I wrote the story then, and then when these protests came up, and I think Vuma again sprang into action to connect foreign journalists with ministers there who could speak about, you know, could respond to the protests. Then I think Boomzile van Dam, the ex-DA MP, she's become quite a sort of Twitter activist, and she started retweeting this what do you call it? And then also the story. And then also at that point, the New Frame journalists, I think they got quite angry because Vuma approached them to sort of try and appease them after their journalists got tortured. And I think at that point, you know, kudos to them, they developed a conscience and they decided to withdraw. But I mean, I think they were on the account for a long time, and they got paid by the local business people there to you know, sort of to polish the image of the Swazi government. Yeah. So I think in that sense, but I do think solidarity as well with journalists in eSwatini, so that they can, you know, because they're on the ground every day. And then also something else I wanted to add. I don't exactly have the positions now, but the media in Zimbabwe is more freedom than the media in eSwatini. I think eSwatini is sort of towards the list on the Press Freedom Index. They're right towards the bottom. And that's also what a journalist said to me. She said, well, in Zimbabwe, there are more international media houses and you know, sort of more of a presence of international media. eSwatini is considered to be too small to have an office. And they reckon that could have played a role as well in the, you know, in the fact that sort of local media in eSwatini is oppressed the way they are.
Thanks, Carien. I think with Vuma Reputation Management, I wonder whether it was developing a conscience or it became a liability to continue to be associated with a government that is responsible for killing people and to be trying to polish its image. And that links to a question that I'll ask you both as journalists to address in a few minutes. But I do want to look at some of the comments in the chat. You know, Stephen Faulkner says, who is supporting the monarchy? There are multinationals who are, and politicians from across the region, and SADC in practice. He says we need to target these vested interests and strengthen civil society, especially the unions to fill the power vacuum. You know, who is supporting the monarchy? I was told by somebody, I don't know, haven't been able to investigate it, that the United States government has in the past been a strong supporter, that the United States has military interests in the new airport in eSwatini. I don't know if it's true or if it's not, but it's something that it's the type of thing that needs to be investigated, because then we will better understand the structures of power. So let me just, Zaba Klachwayo says, the children, please talk about the children who are kept as slaves by the royal family. Velapi Mamba lists 5 key points, 5-point program, an all-inclusive, externally mediated national dialogue, total unbanning of political parties, Podemo, a transitional executive authority, a new democratic constitution, a multi-party democratic dispensation, as those are of demands of people in eSwatini. There's a lot that is being said on the chat. Bheki, you'll be interested to know that there's journalists from the United States who would like to do a podcast with you. We'll make sure that happens afterwards to get these stories out. But let's change tack a little bit, because time is against us, and perhaps take this question of where do we go from here, Bheki? You know, Valapi Mamba said an all-inclusive, externally mediated national dialogue. What is the role of SADC? What is the role of South Africa? Why are our government, my government, so silent in the face of this level of repression, and in the face of conduct which goes completely contrary to the ethos of the South African constitution, at least? Bheki, how do things move forward from here? What do you want as eMswati?
I think as eMswati, you know, I'm satisfied in my mind without any scientific evidence that we all agree there's need for reform. Things are not going well. We've got an economy that is collapsing. We've got a king that is getting more wealthy. There's no doubt that this scale is just not balancing properly, and something needs to be done. But I think when you know, everybody talks about multi-party negotiations and stuff like that. As I said earlier, what has gone wrong with this whole thing, at least in the last couple of months, and that's what bothers me most, is that even though we speak of a government and a king that is not very friendly to freedom of speech, but even those who are agitating for change have taken the same line of thinking, and they are shutting down discussions that interrogate, what do you mean by negotiations? What does that mean? You know, you find people, once that question is asked, no, we'll see that when we get there. For now, and yet we you know, there's experience from around the world about how things go wrong that were well meant, and we have the chance to discuss it. For instance, when the king has been saying since, you know, that he's not going to negotiate with people who are violent, okay, and he's very clear on that. And if you understand him, you can understand where he's coming from. He's being a king. He's being arrogant. He's saying, I'm in charge here, and you're not going to bully me into the table. So how do you deal with that? But one gets the impression that people feel that doesn't matter. What he thinks doesn't matter. The problem is, if you don't pay attention to him, we are going to continue the standoff. You're going to continue this suffering, because in truth, I don't think anybody wants this thing to go on forever. We don't want it to define the rest of our lives, you know, the struggle, as other countries did. And I still hold that it can't be cut short. But we are not talking about it. What does this mean? And remember, let me tell you something else that's important. King Mswati might be a lot of things that are not looking good. But I always hold that we created it as Swazi people. He didn't wake up one morning and decide that. He became a king at the age of 18 years. He knew nothing. And we could go on and on and on about what I mean about that. But we created him. I still hold that we Swazi people made him what he is. Therefore, now that we know what he is and it's not working for us, how do we now deal with that problem? And I think being dismissive about that question is not going to get us anywhere, because he's not going to move. We're not going to get anywhere. And we'll have webinars until the end of the century.
Okay. I'm going to ask you on SADC, Carien. I just want to read something from Kulekani Msweli. Balinzile, please address the issue of police who are allegedly burning schools, as they were captured doing so at Kaboy's school yesterday. Talking about children who want to write exams, please visit us in Vuvulani and I shall share with you the issue of students who will not write exams because they have not paid school fees yet. They are absolute orphans. Let us start there and then proceed to other matters, because those are some of the issues that got us here. So people, Jessica, the schools have been shut down. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted schools in the past months. What does this mean in terms of the future for eSwatini? So a lot of social issues, which Bheki flagged earlier on when he talked about the poverty and the inequality that exists in that country. But Carien, SADC, South Africa, solidarity, what needs to be happening? Is what is happening enough? My understanding is that the SADC delegation that started to go there at the beginning of July disappeared without trace for months and is only now being sent back because people are being killed again. What needs to happen?
Well, Mark, I think the region, SADC, is in a bad position. It's in a bad space at the moment. Every time there's a SADC summit, I know we ask, as journalists, we ask about Mozambique. We ask about the troops in Mozambique. Even this latest summit, Eswatini figured, but Mozambique is the big burning issue right now. South Africa had big problems, like we said, in KwaZulu-Natal. We're still having an aftermath of that. Botswana's having its own problems. The neighbor Zimbabwe is having its own problems. So as a region, we're not in a good space. But I think an important thing of what Bheki said is that the people themselves must start this change. And one thing I do remember when I covered the elections there is the patronage system. How people, they receive gifts from the king, or they receive gifts from politicians. And they depend on this patronage because people are poor, people they don't have food, they don't have money to go study. So there's a big patronage system in place, and I think the leaders in SADC want to see the people want change, but I also do think I remember the last time they went there, the civil society was angry because they were excluded from some of the talks, or they were placed on a lower level, and they had to sit there in the same room as ministers, as politicians, and they didn't trust the politicians. So I do think, in the end, people will have to sit around the table and talk, and South Africa and SADC will have to play that role of mediating, or finding somebody who's credible, who will mediate and will listen to all the sides and bring them together. But I do think also it would involve, us staying switched on all the time. And somebody mentioned business as well. I do think, money, I think perhaps there's money underlying a lot of this. I don't understand all the business structures in Eswatini well enough to know exactly how it's put together. But that was an issue in June when people were burning down the brewery, they were burning down businesses, because the king has a sort of share in all those businesses. I think it's one of the conditions to do business in Eswatini, if I understand correctly, to have the king have a share in the businesses. Even a company like MTN, as South Africans, we could perhaps, as people in the region, we could perhaps ask, why does MTN listen when the king tells them to switch off? And this, I think, this is an Africa-wide issue, and this is going to become more and more important as we see, social media plays a big role in connecting these young people who drive the protests. What can we do in South Africa in terms of putting pressure on the mother company here, in terms of our, consumer pressure? I think we're a little bit stuffed because we are dependent on them for connectivity, and I think most of the mobile companies are, they're kind of one and the same eventually. But perhaps we should find a way of putting pressure on them not to heed to or if there are orders to cut off the connectivity, what can they do to keep people connected? What are the alternatives that they can offer? Because their license conditions are also dependent on whether they listen to the government. So I think this is on various levels. I don't think we should just look at SADC. We should look at the businesses. I think most of the businesses that are operating in Eswatini are South African businesses. How do we put pressure on them to help and affect change if they are amongst the ones who are keeping the status quo in place?
So there's South Africa and Eswatini are intertwined economically, and companies like MTN should be put under pressure not to just do the bidding of the king when they are told to switch off the internet in that country. We're beginning to run out of time. We only have 8 minutes left, so I want you to think about concluding comments, and particularly about what happens from here. Yesterday we had protests. Today, people in the chat are telling us that the streets in Manzini are eerily quiet. We know that even if whether the protests do continue or don't continue, the issues that are behind the unhappiness have not gone away and will not go away. We have 2 MPs in prison. Their names were in the chat. We should be demanding that those MPs are out of prison and that other political prisoners are released. And both of you have said the importance of external mediation, although there are many people in the chat who have no faith in SADC at all. It seems like SADC is a club of political leaders that protect each other rather than protecting the populations of their countries. It seemed to me that this is a time where, if only we hadn't disbanded the SADC tribunal, it would have had an important role to play, or at least as an avenue for complaint. So Bheki, way forward. I can see from the chat that even amongst democratic forces in Eswatini, there are differences of opinion. But what are the critical things that have to happen? I'm asking you as a person speaking to us today from Mbabane.
Well, for me, as a Swazi, as a journalist, what breaks my heart about all this is that the avenues for discussing and answering the question you're answering me are closed on all sides. The government doesn't want that discussion. The people who want change don't want that discussion. Everybody is saying we'll find out when we get to the other side. And to me, it doesn't matter. Unless you're saying the popular thing, get rid of King Mswati or something, anything that says, hang on, let's talk about that. How does that work in a society such as ours? You are then seen as, I don't know what. And if you say that, okay, fine, well, let's all agree, this country is not being run properly, because that's a fact. That's why we're here. We've got poor leadership. I have no confidence in the current government, from the prime minister to the lowest. They don't know what they're doing. But that also gets you people like Neil pulling advertising. So you sort of get caught up in a mess. That's where we're going to keep coming back. We've just gone through a second wave of this problem without any breakthrough. As the person saying in Manzini that it's irrequired. Remember this, Mark. I could have given you everything I have on a bet that Swaziland would never be what we saw in June. I could have sworn. But something happened in June that I would have lost the bet to, because nobody could have predicted that we are capable of what we did to each other then, you know. But here we are. People died again yesterday. There's a standoff, you know, and nobody is saying anything to the other. Nobody wants to talk to anyone. We are in a weird state that is unfamiliar to us. And unfortunately, we don't even have the kind of leaders that have vision. So what you are seeing is everybody, now you got to look at, and this is where the media sort of finds itself in a bind. Everybody's trying to get everybody to shut up, including the media. How that helps the problem, I couldn't tell you, but that's where we are.
Thank you, Bheki. Carien.
Yeah, I think Bheki mentioned that he wouldn't have predicted that eSwatini or Swaziland would have been where it is today. And I think we're in a very interesting moment in terms of COVID. I mean, I see the same thing in South Africa. Our social fabric is damaged here in South Africa. We also had those riots. We never thought the looting and the burning, we never thought it would happen. And perhaps, you know, it's a moment that we should seize on, and hopefully our leaders will have the foresight to see that and say, well, this is a unique moment. We are in uncharted territory. And I see someone in the chat mentioned churches, religion. You know, we had our own Archbishop Desmond Tutu had his birthday the other day. Perhaps we should look at how religion can bring people together. You know, are there any people in a church who could perhaps be an independent mediator? Because people have lost confidence in SADC. People don't trust political leaders anymore. So perhaps we should look at other ways of coming together. That also includes healing our social fabric. It bring us together where we were in lockdown before, and get people use this moment to effect change. But yeah, so I mean that's the optimistic view. I don't want to say what the pessimistic view is, because that's too depressing to contemplate.
Thank you, Carien. Well, let me just sum up this webinar. Again, just noting some of the heated discussion that's gone on the chat. But helpfully, Nancy Heron says, how do we encourage the involvement of human rights organizations such as Amnesty International, United Nations Commissions on Human Rights, Doctors Without Borders? I think they all need to know that there's a crisis going on here that needs external involvement and that needs external support. You know, the bottom line, I think, at the end of this webinar, which I'm glad we've held, is that there is a crisis in eSwatini, and it's not going to go away. And it's a crisis about democracy, and it's a crisis about the freedoms that we expect under democracy: freedom of the press, freedom of protest, freedom of movement. It's a crisis about inequality and about poverty and about the extra pain that COVID-19 has brought to bear on people in Eswatini and in many other parts of the world. I would encourage everybody to read the reports of the campaign for freedom of expression, which was the reason we had this, well, not the only reason, this webinar. If you're not in Eswatini, educate yourself about what is happening in that country so that we can all intervene. I would also encourage international media organizations to look into Eswatini because there are journalists there like Bheki, like the media organization called The Bridge. There are citizen journalists. I'm seeing on a daily basis Facebook postings just by ordinary people that are showing the violence that is taking place in response to protests. And I think most important in this is that we hear the voice of the people of Eswatini and what their needs are, and that we respond to those cries. So, Bheki Makhubu, thank you very much for your input today. I don't know if you have any final comment before I close down, or Carien, but otherwise I want to wish you all strength. But Bheki, any final closing comment?
Well, I won't say much. I think I've said a lot today, but except to say that I just wish we could begin a proper debate, even within eSwatini, on what's going on and how do we get out of this mess we find ourselves in. I think that would be nice. All sides, let's talk among ourselves, not negotiations first, but just having a chat to say, if we talk about dialogue, if we talk about convening whatever meeting, how does that work in our context? I think it would be a good starting point.
Thank you, Bheki. Carien?
Yeah, I just want to say strength to the people in eSwatini, and I think ultimately, if you can find a way to, if you can find suggestions on how the problems will be solved, I think that ultimately the solution will have to come from you. But to everyone in South Africa and outside of eSwatini, please keep up the pressure. Please keep up, you know, help our fellows, you know, neighbors to solve their problems, and then take our eyes off the ball. Keep watching and keep doing what we can.
Thank you, Carien. Thank you, Bheki. Bheki, we've just lost. Thank you, all of you who have been part of this, particularly people who have come under very, very difficult circumstances within eSwatini. Let's keep the discussions going. Let's keep the debate alive. Let's make sure that the truth comes out of that country and is presented to the international community, and that it catalyzes action and that it catalyzes change. Thank you very much, Nicole from the Daily Maverick, for setting this up. And solidarity, strength, peace, and democracy to all of you. We wish you safety and security and peace. Thank you all. Bye-bye.